And this is a longer discussion about like how people really are actually overvaluing writing. This is coming from the greatest writer of the 4th century, at least. Plato has really mastered this technology, but it's really about this other thing that he's created. It's about philosophy's ability to form a soul and form connections between people. And this happens over time, and you need that personal contact for him. And the personal contact, I mean, now you can see it's the network is the thing. The individuals are the thing.
All right, what's up, everybody? This is Other Life. I am Justin Murphy. I just wanted to let you know that I write a free newsletter to thousands of people every week. And honestly, it's really good. It's where I publish my best work, I share events that you can come to, and much more. We have an insane private community around the newsletter, and I honestly think it's the coolest newsletter in the world. And it's free. Go check it out. Just go to otherlife.co. That's otherlife.co. And also, when you subscribe, I'm going to send you a folder of PDFs that contain all of my personal highlights from a bunch of my favorite books that I've read over the years. So you'll get a million insights after just a few minutes of browsing these PDFs, really. They're really special to me, and I just figured I'd share them with you all. So that's otherlife.co, otherlife.co.
All right, what's going on, everybody? This podcast is going to be about the life of arguably the single most influential philosopher ever in the entire history of Western thought, Plato. We, however, are going to focus on something that you've probably never heard anyone talk about when it comes to Plato, which is the question of how practically Plato came to power as a philosopher. Plato, I think, understood some secrets about the nature of influence and how ideas transmit over time through networks. And Plato built his body of work and his famous academy according to a kind of unique operating philosophy that I never heard anyone explain until I met Alex Petkas, who's joining us here today. Alex has a PhD from Princeton in classics, and he's an expert in ancient Greece. He hosts an amazing podcast called The Cost of Glory, which you should totally go subscribe to wherever you get your podcasts. It catalogs the lives of all the great figures of the ancient world. Alex has been actually a member of the Other Life community for a couple years now. I got to know him pretty well at 2 of our annual meetups, and I've been wanting to record this podcast for a long time, so I'm really pleased to finally bring it to you all today. So, Alex, we're already friends. Let's just skip the small talk and tell us, what does the life of Plato have to do with the life of a contemporary thinker, a writer, or a philosopher today? Take us back to that time and just kind of sketch the cultural and economic context. It's kind of weirdly similar to the present in some ways, is it not?
Yeah, it is. And I'll just say thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to share. So, and part because it's been such an inspiring story to me. And so I'm hoping that other people will find it useful. I think Plato's time is really becoming more relevant now, especially because he lives in this world of decentralized, like an academic, not even academic, intellectual free-for-all that is the city of Athens in the late 5th, early 4th century BC, which is a world without intellectual institutions. It's a world, well, not like formal institutions. It's a world with customs, but no certifying bodies. There's no academia, right? He kind of invents the concept, and it's whatever he invents. It's, I think, pretty different from what we normally associate with academia. But so, like, I think to appreciate why Plato is relevant today, you have to understand it. It's a decentralized world, and he's creating new possibilities, and he's also dealing with new media technology that kind of changes the game, and he's one of the major game changers in that play with this new media technology, which is writing. It's not that new. We'll get into this a little bit, but I mean, essentially, writing is kind of newly relevant, new possibilities are being unlocked with writing. It kind of takes a while to hit in Greek culture. It's like full potential. So that's like the big picture here. And I mean, maybe we should get into the story.
Absolutely. Maybe start with writing. What is the experience up until this point with philosophical writing?
Yeah. So writing comes to Greece through Phoenicia in the 9th, 8th century BC. Plato's living in the late 5th, so almost 300 years. But what you have in classical Athens and in the democracies, Athens being the biggest one, that arise in the 5th century, the 400s BC, is widespread literacy for the first time. And this is one of the things about the Greek alphabet that isn't really there with a lot of these Semitic alphabets, is it's not that hard to learn. And, like the Semitic alphabets don't have vowels, which makes it confusing. The Greek alphabet has all the sounds represented at like every phoneme. So with democracy comes this widespread like incentivization for more or less regular people to learn how to write and to read, especially to read. But, if you want to participate in the offices of the democracy, because every citizen can run for office, become a bureaucrat for a year, do important things, you got to learn how to write. So you have in Athens this unique situation for like the first time in Western history where you have a reading public that can actually sustain some kind of a book trade. Now, it's not a lucrative trade because producing a book is very expensive and there's no intellectual property rights. So it's a terrible way to make money. But it's a great way to get your brand out by writing books, and there's people to read it. So as far as like philosophical writing before Plato, there's not a whole lot, but he does describe in the dialogues that he's writing the dialogues starting in the 390s. So he's like probably in his 30s before he really starts producing dialogues. He's looking back at the 430s, the times of the Peloponnesian War, and you definitely get the sense that there's books around that Socrates is buying Parmenides' book. So, and when we talk about books, we're talking about scrolls, and they're not that long, but it's like some intellectual will come to town and he'll give lectures and he'll put out his, for us, like a 20-page summary of his thoughts. Or Parmenides has this poem in hexameters that's pretty short by our standards, but they want to have like a token that people can have. So there is like philosophical writing that's kind of coming out and emerging. But the style is very uneven. They're not easy to read. They're not like, it's not obvious that you should write exactly the way that you talk. And it's like people haven't really worked out what the standard of good writing, of good intellectual writing is. There's historians. Herodotus is writing around this time. People are writing histories, but there's not a lot of like prose writing. So it's kind of, as far as philosophical writing goes, there's like a lot of progress to be made. Let's put it that way.
Okay, so there are books, there are scrolls, and if you're a serious thinker, of which there were some at the time, it behooved you to put down your thoughts and your theories in these books, and these books might be copied a couple times. They might travel a little bit from this new reading public, but the books themselves would not be sold at any kind of scale because it was too difficult to do that, right?
Yeah, I mean, they would be sold. There are books sales, but
no author is making real money from selling books.
No. The person who makes the money is the person who copied the book. So, and that's a different business, right? Like, right. That's the work.
So writing a book back then was basically, as you said at the beginning, a matter of brand, really. It's a matter of you put your ideas down, and if they have currency, if they are important to people, then there will be word of mouth, basically, from the people who read the book down to everyone else.
Essentially, and that's a way you can kind of build other income streams. So, if you're a higher kind of honor philosopher if you have a better brand, you can charge more for pupils if you want to charge for pupils. And so there's the way that you can convert that, but it's not a direct conversion.
So what was Plato's big idea here then? Like, what he's looking at this scene, what is he seeing, and what is he thinking about? Oh, okay, I'm going to insert myself in a novel and more powerful way.
Well, I think to get to this, we have to start to tell a little bit of the beginning of his story and like why he turns to philosophy in the first place. And I think the reason that people don't, there's a good chance that people don't really know this story today, even if you've taken a course or two on Plato in college or have been reading the popular works on your own, like Plato doesn't start off as an 18-year-old thinking, I'm going to be an intellectual, I'm going to be a philosopher, just like Socrates, right? And the reason that we don't hear the story is because he tells the story in this famous problematic text called today the Seventh Letter. And I'll make it brief here, but basically the authenticity of the Seventh Letter is debated today. In antiquity, it was held as genuine. So there's a lot of letters from philosophers and intellectuals floating around in antiquity, and it was proven in the 18th century that by this famous guy Bentley that a lot of these, maybe all of them in his opinion, but certainly a lot of them are spurious. You could call them forgeries, you could call them playful literary fictions, just depending on the case. I mean, and there's so many different versions of this, but so Plato's letters have kind of come under this suspicion, and there's 13 of them, and it's my opinion that the 12 other ones are spurious, but and there's maybe a possibility that some of them are real, but it's my opinion also, and not just me, that the seventh is actually genuine and possibly is the very letter that started the trend of people writing letters and ascribing them to philosophers to tell a kind of lurid, fascinating story and give the kind of character of the philosopher. I'd say today's scholars are like 60-40 maybe against the Platonic authorship of the Seventh Letter, but but I think they're wrong. I have some pretty serious names on my side, like Charles Kahn and A.E. Taylor, and there's a lot of serious people that take the Seventh Letter seriously. And I mean, we could get in the authenticity debate. In a nutshell, it's like you can't prove authenticity. You can only disprove it. And the arguments that you can come up with against the Seventh Letter's authenticity, that are like hard arguments, there's about as many against the Republic. So like,
right.
Did Plato write the Republic?
We'll prove it. Consider it stipulated. For people who don't know, I believe your dissertation was actually about Greek letter writing in particular.
Yeah, so I studied
Take your word for it.
Great.
Stipulate it.
Let's not get into the weeds there. But I just want to clear the air. This is not like a kind of cockamamie theory of some like pseudo. Yeah, I might be a pseudo intellectual, but anyway, this is real. So anyway, and why it's important? Here's why it's important. It's a long letter. It's about 30 pages long. He writes it at the end of his life. It's a retrospective on his whole involvement in this political drama at Syracuse in Sicily, the greatest city of Sicily, the Greek city. But at the beginning of it, he gives an autobiography. He gives his account of why he got into philosophy. And it's fascinating. And people don't read it because it's like, oh, maybe Plato didn't write it. This is the only time in all of Plato's writings where he speaks in his own voice. And he tells his story from his perspective. It's amazing. So here's the story that he tells. When he was a boy, when he was a young man, he wanted to do the thing that all of the other people of his class in society wanted to do. And his class is really the political class in Athens. He's very, very prominent family-wise. His uncle is Critias. Charmides is a cousin of his. He's related to Pericles by marriage on his mother's side. He's a descendant of Solon. I mean, he's just super blue blood Athenian. And what does it for him that kind of changes his directions? He wants to go into power and politics, become a general someday. That was a clear path for him. Is two things. First of all, it is at the end of the Peloponnesian War, which was 431 to 404. Peloponnesian War ends in 404. He's 24 years old, and this is a story that I tell on the Cost of Glory podcast in the life of Lysander, if you want the background. But the Spartans win this great epic war with the Athenians, this inter-Greek war, and they install a pro-Sparta government in Athens. It's called the 30. The 30 tyrants, it's called today sometimes, from the anti-30 perspective. But basically, Plato starts off thinking, oh, great, this is going to be good government at last, because his family is very much the aristocrats, and like maybe democracy is is not the greatest system. It definitely got us into this war. There were all kinds of abuses and demagoguery. Maybe this will be the way that we should run our state, that all Greeks should run their states, the Spartan way, which is oligarchy. The 30 comes to power. His uncle Critias is the number one guy in the 30. His cousin Charmides is another member of this regime. And then the 30 ends up being like pretty bad, actually. They end up being abusive. They have all these threats to their power. They end up, executing citizens for their money. It's a mess. And they try to get Socrates involved because Socrates has got a lot of friends in the 30, and he kind of gets tarred. And the 30 lasts about a year before there's an overthrow of that regime. And everybody wants to distance themselves from the 30 tyrants, and especially from Critias. Critias dies in the revolution, and basically Plato's very uncle becomes, as some people have pointed out, he becomes the kind of Hitler of the 4th century, the person that is the worst possible example of oligarchic excess. Anything that smells like Critias is bad. We can't. So Critias is like the Hitler, and Plato's his nephew. And so Plato tells this story very, very briefly in the 7th letter. He's like, I realized maybe I didn't want to get into politics at that point. And what happened after that was even worse, because within a few years, there's all these legal recriminations and, kind of infighting among the Athenian political classes. And this is how Socrates ends up getting executed, because he was associated with the regime of the 30. Corrupting the youth is kind of a metonym for being associated with the young kind of fascist youth that were supporters of the 30. And so maybe it was because he was teaching impiety, or maybe it was just because he was associated with the wrong people, that Socrates gets executed by a court of his own countrymen. And Plato says after that, this was kind of a wake-up moment for me. And there's a passage in there where he says something in the 7th letter very similar to what he says in a point in the Republic. That was when I decided that woes will never cease for mankind until either the rulers come to love philosophy or philosophers come to be rulers. And I'm paraphrasing there, but that's the gist of what he says. And essentially he says, from then on, I was on a quest to figure out what was the alternative. How could because one of the things he says, I'll just read right here, a sentence or two. The older I grew, the more I realized how difficult it is to manage a city's affairs rightly. It's there were a lot of people who thought democracy was the best system. Plato and Critias and maybe Socrates thought oligarchy was the better system. But look what happened. For I saw it was impossible to do anything without friends and loyal followers, and to find such men ready at hand would be a piece of sheer good luck, since our city was no longer guided by the customs and practices of our fathers, while to train up new ones was anything but easy. So maybe you find the right system, but you put the wrong people in charge of that right system. And to me, this sums up why Plato turns to philosophy. This is his big idea as far as the motivation for the whole project of what he does, is to find such men that are so difficult to find. Okay, it's one thing to come up with the system, but then you have to either locate, gather, or create the people that can be the ideal rulers of a state. And that's his retrospective, as he's age 70, looking back on a crisis. But so I think if you look at that, he spends the next maybe 10 years starting to write. That's when he starts writing the dialogues. And so I think first of all, one takeaway just from that at the very beginning is here's an intellectual, a writer who had real ambition, real worldly ambition that really fueled him. And it wasn't a lack of concern for practical affairs that fueled a man like Plato. He's channeling that into his work. And I think if you have that ambition, there's definitely ways to see that as like fuel rather than a distraction to your intellectual project. Okay, and which kind of goes against, I think, some of the received wisdom that you might get in a kind of academic context.
Hey everybody, this is just a quick interruption to invite you to the new Other Life community, which I've been working on now quietly for the past year. We're really moving now in the direction of a network state. It's pretty crazy. We will give you a fully fledged personal server and a special desktop application from our partners at the Holium Company that will let all members communicate with each other and compute together on the peer-to-peer sensor-proof Urbit network. So it's still early, but I think it's insanely cool. All I want to say is that if you're into the Other Life ethos, like if you're a writer or a software developer or whatever, but you're all about freedom and self-reliance outside of institutions, then we really want to meet you. The community now is totally free. We have other ways now of filtering and sorting people later based on their abilities. So it's kind of like the USA of the 1840s. Like anyone could get on a ship and go to America, but only some would rise the ranks depending on what they were able to do. So to join, just go to otherlife.co/join. That's otherlife.co/join. I sincerely look forward to meeting you, and that's all I have for now. Back to the show.
Yeah, there's this impression a lot of people have that a life of academic humanism must be a life that rejects worldly affairs and ambitions. And you're saying that, no, at the very founding of Western philosophy, the opposite was the case.
Yeah, definitely. And so he's looking at the scene, he starts writing, and here are the playbooks. There's three basic playbooks that he can see. Okay. First of all, there's the traditional one, the poet. The poet is the Greek intellectual par excellence of the archaic period, the kind of pre-classical world of Greeks, maybe sort of pre-democratic. This is an ancient Indo-European role, of course, the epic bards, Homer and the Vedas. So, but in Greek culture, the poet is, they're composing mythic poems, they're retelling stories for occasions. They're sometimes local, they're sometimes itinerant. The really good ones are probably going around from city to city, collecting big fees, prizes. And these are really producers for leisure events. They're party performers, and yet they are seen as edifying educational figures.
And they can make good money?
They can make money. It's the patron model for the most part, but a really well-off a really well-respected poet, you will find them tutoring sons of wealthy men, and maybe they'll have a farm or something. They're probably from the upper crust of society, and there's a big range in poets too. But there's definitely a model there for converting your kind of entertainment creds into more stable income through tutoring, teaching kids to memorize Homer and other poems. So that's a traditional model. And they'd call it musike, music, the art, the stuff of the muses, which is not just music, it's also poems. It's the stuff of memory. Model 2, more recent. It's the logographer, the speechwriter. And this is really important in Athens because in their legal system, you can't, if you want to prosecute somebody or defend yourself from a prosecution, you can't hire a lawyer. You have to speak in your own person. And so you can get somebody to write a speech for you that you can perform. Nobody has to know that you bought a speech and memorized it. And there's definitely a market for that. That's a great way to make a steady income. The most famous figures associated with this, Lysias, Isocrates actually did this earlier in his career. Isocrates goes on to be a big competitor of Plato's. Antiphon, the teacher of Thucydides, the historian. And there's a way to kind of parlay that speech writing platform into political theory. This is what Antiphon does. The Thucydides is kind of in this world of like logographer, speechwriter, political theorists. There's definitely like, you can see the, knowing the affairs of the city, knowing how to write, argue, they bleed over really easily and nicely. But so that's kind of like an intermediate category. The third category is the famous one that people are most familiar with probably, that's the sophist. If you've read any of Plato's dialogues, you probably know about figures like Gorgias, Protagoras, these great public intellectuals who are often kind of itinerant, but Athens is like the New York City of the Greek world. And they're coming in, and they're probably bringing some books with them to Athens, but it's kind of like a modification of the poet model, where they're public entertainers first and foremost, and then they gather students together. But they teach you about a range of issues, and they have like kind of different methods than the poet. They talk about teaching arguments, and they'll also teach you about the myths. But they have just a whole range of things, and it's not just like they're not just promising to teach you how to speak, but they're also like, there's not really a distinction in the minds of your normal citizen between those guys and somebody like a Parmenides or Empedocles or Heraclitus, who we would think of as like, that's the philosophy department, and then Gorgias and Protagoras, that's like the English department. Like we see this clear distinction in our mind because Plato made the distinction for us. There's not really a distinction before Plato between the sophists, the rhetoric professors, and the kind of more metaphysical, physiological thinkers. So these are the models that Plato's looking at, and he ends up doing something different. And I don't think he's really figured out what it is in the 390s, but he starts writing these dialogues. And I think really interesting to look at the early dialogues and what exactly he does. And this is, for me, a lesson that I've tried to apply with my own podcast, and I think it's something that Plutarch really picked up on. Start by channeling the authority of people that are already familiar to your audience. Look at who are the characters in the early dialogues. Gorgias, Laches and Nicias, famous generals. Ion, this famous poet, Protagoras, famous sophist. And Plato is essentially writing historical fiction about these people, these dialogues, famous figures with Socrates interacting with them. So he's telling stories about people that everyone's already interested in. There's like a lot of name recognition that we don't really see, but they would have seen. I think that's a really important part, that he's channeling that authority. And he's also, we talked about how you don't make money off of books, but it's a way of brand building. He's writing for, he's really leveraging this technology of writing to the max by writing, and he's not just writing for an Athenian audience. I think you can really see this at the very beginning of his dialogues. He's really writing for this pan-Hellenic audience, because the Greek world is all of these independent city-states, from Sicily, from Marseille in France, all the way to, Phocaea and Cyprus, and it's all over the Mediterranean. And there's like wealthy, well-connected people in all these places, and there's a reading public there that you can't make money off of selling books to them, but you could definitely get your brand out and your ideas out. And people are looking for good books. So you write the absolute best possible thing you can write. And Plato's dialogues they have this combination of seeming familiar and colloquial, and like you're there with these guys, and it's really smooth, and it's, even the kind of technical stuff, it's not that hard to understand, but it's not actually as colloquial as it seems in Greek. It gives the impression of being colloquial, but he writes in a style that actually doesn't have all of these local Attic, slangs and phraseologies that you would only know if you were an Athenian. It's a very kind of polished international Greek, and you can contrast it with the plays of Aristophanes. But Plato is really writing for this international, or this interstate audience, like brand building on a large scale.
Okay, interesting. So just to pause on those 2 points. The first one is that when you're first starting out as a writer or thinker, no one cares about you, but they care about the big famous names they've heard about, that they have a kind of respect for already. And so if you're just channeling them, they're going to listen to you because you're channeling these names that people already respect. That was one, it sounds like, one of Plato's kind of key insights that helped him be successful. But it sounds like the other is that whereas minor writers or less great writers such as Aristophanes were writing in a local dialect for a local audience using the language and the norms and the points of interest to a smaller audience. Plato said, no, I'm going to go as general as possible. I'm going to try to produce the most significant, truthful things I can that are maximally relevant to the maximum number of people ever. And that's another choice he made that you think led to his great success. Is that understanding it correctly?
I think that's fair. And it's also another way to think about it is like, Aristophanes, the man on the street can just go to the plays of Aristophanes and laugh his ass off because there's, fart jokes and they'll talk about, that special Athenian sausage. And like for a long time, I'm sure that Aristophanes that's a way to immediately just reach a big audience, like popular, fun stuff. But Plato goes not so much general, but like he targets the upper crust across the Mediterranean. Like there's, it's a small number of people who can actually read these things and who actually is interested in reading these things. And he's aiming at those people from the get-go. And that's a longer game. Like that's a far-seeing game. Like I want, whatever this project ends up being, I want to get the best people interested in this from the get-go. The smartest, most ambitious kind of people that I can find in the Greek world.
And just to pause on that, not to belabor a point, but to make it super clear, this is really relevant to people in our orbit, in the Other Life community, or just people like us, people in our networks, because this is essentially what's at stake in the current kind of strategic question one has to answer for oneself about, are you going to try to build a big audience fast, or are you going to try to do really sophisticated original work and build a smaller but more elite audience over a longer amount of time? This is still a trade-off that we face today. And it sounds like, learning from the life of Plato, you lean towards this view where it's like, don't go for the lowest common denominator, trying to write in a kind of accessible vernacular that's going to be like really cool and fun for a specific type of, larger mass audience, but rather do the most sophisticated work possible. So your work will spread among the small number of elite people who are interested and capable of understanding that.
That is really what I think Plato's playbook is. And it's like, that's not an easy niche to address. Like there are plenty of niches where you could, signal and go viral within these various verticals within kind of internet writing. But, how well is that going to transfer that? Think of your kind of like internet vernacular niche as one city, but can you target the kind of the people across a number of different cities while kind of staying true to what you think is the essence of whatever community you think you associate the most with, something like that maybe.
Right. Yeah. In other words, if you could be admired and respected as a thinker by 500 billionaires and millionaires and powerful, educated, sophisticated people, you would much rather have just an email list of those 500 people following you than an email list of probably 100,000 normal people. The first one is literally more valuable and more influential and more powerful, according to the practical worldview of Plato's model.
That's right. Yeah. And I think that as you go on through Plato's career, you really see this playing out. So I'm kind of retrojecting, but I think it's there from the beginning.
No, that's fantastic. Let's just play it forward. Tell us about maybe, well, if you know the best way to take it, feel free to override my suggestion, but maybe the next question would be, what was his first big break? He starts off as writing these dialogues. Does he immediately have currency and significance because of how he's sociologically positioned? Or is he kind of toiling in obscurity for a little while and then has a big break? Like, how does his rise unfold?
Yeah, it's hard to say whether it was a break or not, but the first moment where he kind of enters the stage of history is in 388 BC. He's 40, so he's born in 428, so he's like 40 years old. Probably been writing dialogues for a good 10 years. He goes west to the Italian Greeks, southern Italy, and to Sicily. And this is something that he talks about in his seventh letter. Another great text on this, if you want to, while it's on my mind, is Plutarch's Life of Dion, and we'll talk about Dion a little later, associate of Plato. So Plato goes, and we're not really sure why he goes west for certain, but there's a pretty good guess we can make. And what the one reason that the sources agree on is that he wanted to see Mount Etna. The Greeks don't have active volcanoes in Greece, but Mount Etna is an active volcano, and Empedocles supposedly threw himself into it when he decided his time was up. And you want to see Mount Etna, kind of scientific interest, maybe. But there are, well, first of all, he ends up visiting at some point on this trip, he ends up visiting Syracuse for the first time. This is his first visit to Syracuse, the first of 3. And he actually somehow gets welcomed into the court of maybe the most powerful man at the time in the Greek world of all, Dionysius, the tyrant of Syracuse, who was this great, legendary Mussolini kind of figure who seized power in this democracy and just out of sheer competence built up this really impressive kind of empire on the island. And like most of the Greek cities in Sicily are subject to Dionysius, and several of the cities in southern Italy. Of course, the coastline of southern Italy and Sicily is heavily, heavily Greek, and it has been for centuries at this point. But so Plato gets he makes friends with Dionysius, and there's stories about their interactions. Maybe they were kind of, there's some testiness on both sides, and I some of these stories are apocryphal, but essentially Plato says in the 7th letter, I was not that impressed with Dionysius's court. It was not a healthy place. There was. And Dionysius is known as a lover of culture, but it was a lavish place. It was it was not. Socrates would have been kind of bored and disgusted. It's the impression that he gives. But he got invited and he hung out there. So he was interested, right? And this might have had something to do with the fact that he had an international reputation. Maybe it was his family connections. I mean, I'm sure you go to Dionysius and you're like, hey, this is the nephew of Critias. He'd be like, whoa, bring him in. So maybe it was family connections. But
Critias was like Hitler.
Yeah,
I mean, these are powerful men who don't much care about these like social stigmas, presumably, right? If you're a Mussolini figure and you're kind of dominant and in control, in power, you're not going to be scared away by the fact that it happened to be Hitler's nephew.
Right. Yeah. So that might have been part of it. The other thing that Plato's doing over there is he's getting to know the philosophers in southern Italy, and there's some really interesting things going on. And it's a shame we don't really have great sources on this, but there's in Tarentum, which is in the kind of instep of the boot of Italy, and that is an old Greek city. A powerful Greek city, one of the big ones. It's starting to look like philosophers are running the place. This is where Pythagoras ended up, in Tarentum. He was from back east, but he ended up founding communities like around Tarentum. And the most famous Pythagorean of this period is Archytas, Archytas, Archytas of Tarentum, who is like one of the closest things you get to a philosopher king looking figure in this period. Now, Archytas is he's not actually a king. He's like a first man in the state, kind of like a Pericles. And again, it's a democracy. It's like a collective government at Tarentum. But Archytas is famous for mathematical theories, but he's also like a general and a politician. And the Pythagoreans of Tarentum are actually starting to be very influential. And this is a story I tell in the life of Agesilaus that I just finished as the king of Sparta. Agesilaus' great nemesis is this guy Epaminondas of Thebes, who was trained by a Pythagorean named Lysis, who was an exile from Tarentum. So the Pythagorean philosophers are starting to get a lot of influence. And this Epaminondas is like probably around Plato's age. maybe a little younger, and he's living as a vegetarian. He doesn't take a wife. He's like he's the real deal kind of like philosopher leader. So this is kind of where it's happening. Tarentum, the East is where you're kind of getting this, maybe a solution to Plato's problem that he kind of began with, of like, how do you associate philosophy and power and like have a better state run by better people? And they may have figured it out. So he makes friends there. It's not really clear the details, but whatever he learns, he takes back. And this is, scholars typically divide his dialogues into the early period, the middle period, and the late period. And the middle period is like, so the visit to the West is the dividing point between the early period and the middle period. And Plato comes back and with lessons from the Pythagoreans. And this is when he writes his most, iconic, famous dialogues, probably the Republic, middle period dialogue, the whole idea of a philosopher king. He's thinking of people like Archytas, maybe of Dion. He writes the Phaedo, the Phaedrus, Symposium, all of these dialogues that have, well, we could talk more in detail about the dialogues, but there's Pythagorean elements all over these things. The importance of mathematics, like Plato has this conviction that rulers, people who are destined to rule, need to study objective math. They need to, and this is a lot of what they do in the academy. And this is around the time that he founds his school. Probably once he returns from southern Italy is when he founds his school. He's built, we have to imagine this. He's built up enough of a reputation, and he has students willing to join him in this endeavor. And this is like when he founds the academy, which is outside the walls of Athens. It's named after, his school is named after this outdoor gymnasium called the Academia in Athens. He buys a little plot of land there, and he starts doing whatever he does at the academy. And it seems to be, okay, math is an important part of that. And it's not just like astrology and numerology. It's like real geometry. Like Euclid kind of comes from the Platonic tradition, actually, in the next generation. He comes back, he founds his school. And I think that it's really the idea of the school is one of the big takeaways that he had from the Pythagoreans. And they were real innovators in terms of like building communities around philosophy that lasts generation to generation. These kind of like ascetic brotherhoods that you have in the early Pythagorean communities that we don't know a whole lot about, but this is something that Plato probably took from them, actually.
So could you pause on that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier Pythagoras going around and founding communities. And I was curious when you said that. I was kind of curious what that meant exactly. Give us just real quick a sketch of what are these communities. So I get the impression, are these like really determined, committed men who are almost leaving society to pursue the truth and like weird vegetarian like habitats, like living in caves or something? That's kind of the impression I get, but am I wrong? What are these communities exactly? How do they work?
That's the basic idea. Pythagoras is a real guru kind of a figure, and he has all these weird rules that you have to follow. Like when you get up out of your bed, don't leave an impression on your bed. That's like haram to leave an impression on your bed. Don't eat beans. You can't eat beans besides animals. Maybe because beans have souls. It's not really clear.
But these men were not forming families and living like normal civic lives. Were they?
It's like some of them were. He wasn't totally against like marriage and procreation, but there's definitely a sense that they were living apart, and they were persecuted too. And I don't know the history all that well. It's not on the tip of my fingers, but they do get driven out of communities for being weird. And maybe it's because they have political ambitions and they're starting to, try to get influence in the state. And this is something that their enemies can leverage against them. They're weird.
And how are they making money? How are they making money? And B, what types of productions are they actually doing, right? Because are they just like drawing symbols on the floor in dust, or are they producing books as groups? Are they going on lecture tours? What are they producing exactly, and how are they making money?
I don't know, and I don't know. I think this is really the patronage model. The evidence is so spotty and kind of anecdotal. But maybe I'll research that and get back to you on that.
Sure.
But
the point is that Plato sees there's power here. He sees, well, these Pythagoreans are doing something, and they're gaining currency, they're gaining influence, they're making a dent in how people think about the world. And so what does Plato take from that? What is Plato's vision, and how does he begin building it?
One thing that scholars think he definitely that he was very inspired from the Pythagoreans from is the importance of mystery. Remember, I talked about Pythagoras. There's a kind of a sense that it's a religious cult, that there's like layers of commitment, and you don't see everything if you're on the outer layer, but as you work your way in, you get more and more, forthright revelation of, maybe you didn't find out about the beans thing until you got into the fourth circle. And that's one of the reasons why they're so secretive about their teachings. But so mystery cults are a much wider phenomenon in the Greek world,
right,
of course. And the Eleusinian mysteries, famously at Athens, it's like this kind of a semi-private, semi-public religious experience. It's kind of another story. Mystery just means secret in Greek. So there's like secret cults that you have to be initiated into to get into the protected space and the inner sanctum, to see whatever it is you were supposed to see and not tell anybody about. And this is a powerful, powerful aesthetic that you see in the Republic. For example, the dream at the end, the myth of there's like a kind of a culmination point, obviously in the story of the cave. It's kind of an inverted mystery cult, maybe, because you want to get out into the light. But the symposium is there's all this kind of sense of, that you have to penetrate deeper into the nature of reality to really see what the gods see, and that it takes asceticism, it takes a kind of moral seriousness to get there, it takes an intellectual seriousness, and that there's some kind of vision that is salvific. And I'm not saying that that's like his doctrine, but that's definitely an aesthetic of these stories that he tells in the dialogues, especially at this period. And you can kind of hypothesize at this point that this was the dynamic of his school, but definitely from the schools, the Platonic schools of late antiquity that I studied directly much more in my work, and what people we just have a ton of evidence about this, that this is the way that philosophical schools, especially Platonic philosophical schools, which continued for about a millennium after Plato died, that the way that it works is you have like kind of layers of commitments at the school. You have the hearers, like the philosopher will give a kind of a public lecture on some kind of anodyne but entertaining subject, and that'll be used to to edify you and maybe tempt you, hopefully, into wanting to learn more. And as you kind of spend more time, maybe you kind of increase your financial commitment in some very polite, gentlemanly way that is not a transaction, it's a gift maybe, but the levels of commitment correspond to your level of initiation, access to the master, and like access to the truths contained within Plato. Like Plato wrote his text in such a way that it suggests that there's a deeper meaning to the dialogue that you don't get on a first reading. And this is a thing that people are already doing with the myths of Homer and Hesiod. They're already talking about allegory and like deeper meanings to the myths. So he's drawing on a lot aesthetically, and I think that this corresponds, even at this stage, certainly at a later stage, to the way that the school itself is structured of like there's a hierarchy.
Okay.
So that's one thing that he gets from the Pythagoreans.
So he's using mystery strategically to create a larger structure that pulls people in and makes people curious and motivated to go deeper. And if the text isn't giving you everything on the surface of the text, well, I guess I got to go to Plato's Academy physically to try to figure out what's really going on here.
This is really key. And this dynamic is very clear in the seventh letter. It's one of the things that modern philosophy department people don't like about it. They don't want Plato to be like that. But it's very clear in the seventh letter. And you know,
Why don't they like that?
Well, okay, let's talk about the seventh letter for just a sec here. I think the bias against it comes from two sources. One, the fact that Plato is getting involved with tyrants in Sicily and, supporting a totalitarian regime or something. And he's also very explicit about his belief that the Greeks should drive the Carthaginians off the island of Sicily. There's this long conflict between Greeks and Carthaginians on Sicily. And he's like, let's drive the barbarians away. So he's kind of an imperialist, just like Dionysius was, and most Greeks of this period were. But that's distasteful to some, obviously. The other thing that people don't like about it is arguably he undercuts the entire project of academic Platonic philosophy as it's practiced today, because he says, in my writings, I never put the essence of what I teach in my school into my writings. It would be silly to do so. And I've never written down my doctrines, actually. So, like, it doesn't totally undermine everything that philosophy departments do, but essentially he says, you can't get the real thing from a text. And and this is certainly an impression that you already get from the Republic, that there's like something more there. You just want him to speak straight with you, maybe, if you want to know what it really means. And but like he's still and this mystery function has a tempting effect too, right? Like just like the earlier dialogues, he's trying to entertain, channel authority, I think, in the early, the so-called aporetic dialogues, but in these middle dialogues especially, he's really turning up the seduction. And so one example of this is the description of, if you look at the description of the ideal philosophical character in book 6 of the Republic. So he describes, he and Glaucon, I think, they're Adamanthes, whatever. They're having this discussion, Socrates, about, what kind of character it would be suited to eventually become a philosopher king. And what does he look like? He's smart. He learns quickly. He's strong of body, but like curious, sensitive, probably from a wealthy family, probably like well-bred. I mean, he's essentially describing his ideal student, and he says characters like that tend to either the people who have their potential, that have the potential to do the greatest good, also have the potential to become the worst people, and so they need proper training. And now it has a function within the argument of the Republic, but it also is like, hey, you get this far in the book, you're probably one of these people, and you're probably going to be like, maybe I should meet this Plato guy, or at least find somebody who knows about him. So it's, in a way, it's like a calling card for his students as they kind of go out and make connections, and they start, spreading the network. Like,
right,
it's a tool for that too.
Talk more about networks now. Talk about how the ideas and the books produce disciples and readers, and how Plato uniquely and intelligently fomented this network structure. What was the shape of that network structure? How did he facilitate it? What do we know about his viewpoints regarding that network structure? And just try to unpack that.
Yeah. Well, there's two ways to go about that. One is to look at people, actual people. Another is to look at passages that talk about this. Let's talk about some people first. There are there's lists in antiquity of all of Plato's students who went on to get involved in politics. I could name some names, like this passage from Athenaeus. Euphraeus sojourned with King Perdiccas in Macedonia, and Philip of Opus seized power in his own state. Parmenio, the Macedonian, caught him and put him to death, and risk takers, huh? Callippus the Athenian, this is a guy who Plato maybe sent to help Dion stage a coup in Syracuse later, and ended up murdering Dion very embarrassingly to Plato. Euagon of Lampsacus. There's all these names of like Plato's students going on and like doing stuff in their cities. And so like if you look at the list of the names, they're from all over the Greek world, especially cities that were allied with Athens in the Athenian maybe second league, but they're not necessarily. That's Timaeus of Cyzicus. He made himself a tyrant in his own city in Asia Minor, and like they're definitely getting involved. I think a lot of what we know about how networks work in practice comes from later sources, the way that they write letters to each other and their practices around writing letters. But there's definitely a lot of economic connection, people sailing here and there and carrying letters back and forth. And this is, what it does is it ties in with a very ancient Greek institution of friendship, of guest friendship, of hospitality. The Athenian, Plato, and I think Greeks in particular, all Greeks, are very much believers in this idea that your network is your net worth. And so it's like something that you even see in the Homeric poems, where your power in your own city has a lot to do with who your friends are in other cities. Because in this the Greek world, it's just a very decentralized and yet highly, highly interconnected world. And this is one of the reasons that they care so much about guest friendship and gift giving, and they talk about this obsessively. You could even see this in Homer. It's another reason why the Greeks are so obsessed with their culture, that being a Greek, because this is the common ground that they build their kind of like power, their personal like fortune of friends on, is this common culture that they can relate on poetry and music. So there's something really deep that he's tapping into, but he's making it specific with this kind of brotherhood of philosophy, this kind of shared participation in the mysteries of knowledge of the forms or whatever it is that you learn, of geometry, this kind of common culture that he's building through long, long contact in person.
Okay, so let's drill down into that though, and really sketch for us the diagram, if you will, the engineering diagram. Like, what types of things is he doing and how are they connecting? So for instance, is he giving lectures? Is he touring and giving lectures in different areas? Is he charging money for these lectures? Is he, when he publishes a book, where is it going exactly? And where is the academy meeting? How often is it meeting? Try to get into some of these details of like, what is the Platonic machinery look like as a whole?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, a lot of it's conjectural. Just our sources are kind of thin, but it's clear that they spend a lot of time studying, like literally, how do you, determine the length of a hypotenuse if you know the legs, and how do you get the area of a circle and stuff like that. But they are definitely doing a lot of what you see in the Platonic dialogues, like interrogating concepts through dialectic. I think that they're also doing a lot of really regular stuff. So Plato probably has some kind of exoteric teaching that he lectures regularly, to do the whole public facing thing. It's not really, there's no evidence of what, when he does that or how often or what exactly the contents are, but just like that's probably happening. In addition to the esoteric stuff that only the kind of inner circle gets. And And so probably, so what is a presumption of the whole project is whatever you can get from an Isocrates, from a Gorgias, from a Lysias, you can get at Plato's school. You are going to learn how to speak in public. You are going to learn to be a leader, to be like a person in society. It's not all math and, abstruse, annoying, Socratic bickering that you see in some of these aphoretic dialogues. There's some of that, but it's only a part of it. And it's really like he is really staking everything on this is the best leadership training. It's got to work for ambitious people, and it's got to be plausible. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that it's not just like, majoring in getting a master's in philosophy.
Okay, and how was it intertwined with these powerful figures, the wealthy people, the tyrants, and so on? Like, are these people donating to the academy to keep it going? Are they giving land? What are they doing? And also, maybe in the same breath, connect that to the other kind of economics. Like, I know Socrates, I think, was charging for students, but Plato was not. So kind of explain the underlying economic model.
Yeah, that is... Plato talks in so many of the dialogues about how Socrates doesn't charge for lessons, right? This seems to be a hint that he's saying, I'm not like Isocrates over there. I'm not like all these other guys that are charging big fees. Because you look at somebody, so Plato's greatest competitor is Isocrates. He's about the same age. Starts off as a logographer, ends up becoming just basically a trainer of rhetoric, but he calls himself a philosophos. So they're the same category in people's minds. The whole distinction between Isocrates and Plato is like one is a philosopher and one is a rhetorician. Like it's completely invisible to the contemporaries. Isocrates has very wealthy students.
And just to be clear, this concept of the philosophos, this is like brand new, right? This is kind of unprecedented, or
it's around as an adjective.
But it's not a lifestyle. It's not a
lifestyle.
It's not a known vocation or a known way of actually living out a whole life with this as your profession. It's
a synonym for sophist, if anything, a less common synonym for sophist. That's more like an adjective, a lover of wisdom. Okay, what's that supposed to mean?
But I guess just trying to make clear for readers and listeners, like the term sophist is often thought of as a pejorative term. It's referring to someone who's kind of, will teach you to do anything with words to get your way, essentially, right? And this idea of the philosopher as of discovering the objective truth of reality and that distinction between the philosopher and the sophist, that's what's at stake here, right? That's what's being kind of invented, essentially. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, that's correct. I think that's correct.
And basically, Plato is discovering the economic machinery to make the philosopher powerful and sustainable, and for the philosopher to exist in a real economic material way, right?
Right. So what ends up, and I think you can give Plato a lot of credit for this, but I'm not sure he deserves all the credit. But what ends up becoming the standard model for philosophers later is you teach rhetoric and you get paid to teach rhetoric, and then that'll pay your bills, and you have a few students that are, that will do philosophy with you, and that is kind of like the moral mission that almost gives you, and philosophy isn't just like this kind of icing on the cake, it kind of gives you this added credibility. It's a way to up your game as a rhetorician, to say that you can offer something more serious. But the money really comes from teaching young men how to speak and write. Now, what Plato is doing is, it's not clear that he's charging for anything like that. He's well off. His students, I think he probably is operating more on a kind of gift-giving model, where the real economic machine, if there is one, to support the work of philosophy is the network of wealthy people. That it's more about power than it is about money, if that makes sense. And you can leverage connection with powerful people for financial gain, but it's indirect.
And how is he getting it, though? How does he indirectly solicit it? Is he going on, a donation tour, asking and inviting? Is it all kind of backdoor, like you're not supposed to ask, you're supposed to just wait till it's gifted? Tell us about how it actually works.
Yeah, we can kind of speculate, but basically, I think the way that it works is he has this big tour to the West. He probably makes other tours that we don't know about. But the standard thing would be you make some tours, you talk to some powerful people, you recruit some students, and then you have your students, once you've trained them up, do the same thing when you get older, and you can stay in place and kind of have your people go out and make connections on your behalf. But there's an interesting, so in Greek, the word for honor, time, is also the word for price. And this is very important in Homer, for example. But what Plato is trying to do, and he talks about this, like it's all over the place in the seventh letter, is he's very concerned about the time of philosophy, the honor of philosophy. And there are other words that talk about financial price. And it's not like there's an ambiguity there. He is talking about honor, but like they do think of honor in very concrete terms as like the price that you're worth, like that you would be ransomed for example. And so there is this kind of like more archaic gift-giving culture that there is an economy there, but it's hard to quantify. And part of the point of it is that it's harder to quantify because once you quantify it, you almost set a cap to it, right? But it's, I would call it more of a power network than an economic network. But other people at the same time are using philosophy as the kind of the extra that they can offer to kind of get a one-up on these regular old teachers of rhetoric, of public speaking. And philosophy definitely it's starting to get that honor, that credibility that makes it like, a prestige educational brand. That makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Plato's Academy is basically offering all of the practical things you would get from the other rhetoric teachers or the sophists, but also this other special thing, this new thing of philosophy, which is somewhat enigmatic, but also more prestigious.
Yeah, he invents the idea of philosophy as a prestige brand for education. It wasn't like prestigious before then. It was, yeah.
I'm still just trying to fill in a few gaps in understanding how this magically produced big backers that were actually like sending checks, and so obviously not checks at the time, whatever, actually sending resources to make this thing run. I'm trying to, maybe we just don't have that on record, but you did talk a little bit about Plato going to Syracuse and these kinds of stories. Like, just try to fill that in a little bit more if you could, and then I'll stop pressing you.
Yeah. I think people probably end up paying their own bills. They're probably wealthy enough to just support themselves, and Plato is wealthy enough that maybe they'll make a donation when they get there, and so that you get free meals if you come. But it's not like it's like a capital intensive sort of thing.
Okay, so basically, it is a big background variable here that Plato was born into money and had a certain base level of resources that he could live on and kind of coast on. And
yes, and his students too. Important.
And his students,
people he's going after. Yeah.
Okay, great. So that's fair enough, and that explains my confusion around that. But nonetheless, what he's doing is he's basically brokering power, not money. That's what you meant by that. That the money itself is kind of taken care of. That's sort of in the background. That's kind of abstracted out because we are talking about essentially privileged people. But what he's doing brilliantly is just basically building relationships with powerful backers on the one hand, and then through his writing, he is basically selecting for the cream of the crop in terms of students. The students come into the academy, and then he gives them this kind of sophism plus package, if you will, and that sends them off into the world to have much more success than they would have otherwise. And he actually succeeded in this. And that's right. And then those people presumably give back to the academy in certain ways. And that's the machinery. That's the power machinery in a nutshell. Or what am I missing? Or what?
Yeah, that's right. I think that's right. Yeah, and that's how he gets the endowment, so to speak, right, from the very loyal alumni. That's there, I think, clearly, and he does create it does kind of like this pairing of rhetoric and philosophy as a business model. is something that he is pioneering. So there are other people that are able to build businesses kind of because of this brand that Plato has created later, for sure. But maybe it would make sense to go and look at what he does in Syracuse as an example of like how this works.
Yeah.
So in 367, Plato gets an invitation to come back to Syracuse. One of the friends he made there was a marriage relation of the tyrant of the Mussolini, of Dionysius the First, and his name is Dion. Confusingly, they have the same 4 letters, their first name. So Dion is some kind of relative by marriage, and Dionysius' son, Dionysius the Second, we all just call Dionysius from here on out. Okay, it's the younger, Dionysius the Younger, is now the tyrant of Syracuse. And Dion invites Plato, come back to Syracuse. I think we have a lot of potential here. By this time, Plato is 60. He's got his school. He's got his, some of his greatest ideas worked out about, the Republic is out. Dion's read it. So Dion was a young man, maybe in his 20s when Plato visited the first time, and he met Plato there and they became friends. And Dion has been keeping in touch all these years, and he invites him back because now he knows what Plato's all about. And he says, this is maybe an opportunity to turn Dionysius II, the Younger, toward philosophy. The problem is Dionysius II, well, first of all, he's been neglected apparently by his father. He's just not been very well educated. Another problem is he's in his late 20s. Maybe he's late because old as 30. So he's kind of set in his ways more than Plato would like. But and he loves to party, all the wealth and the courtiers and the ladies and the drink, and he just doesn't live a very sober life. And Dion really, there's a lot at stake, like the control of the island of Sicily by the Greeks. But Plato, as Dion knows from experience, is the sort of guy that can get through to a young man. Like if your son is, struggling with video games, you might call in Plato. Can you talk to him? Like Plato is just incredibly winning in person. And so he has some hope that Plato can get through to this kid. So he invites Plato to Syracuse. And so Plato visits Syracuse, and they basically try to win over Dionysius II to philosophy, to a more sober way of life. And I think that shows Dion. There's clearly a serious political game here. Like, right, if Dion can get Plato influencing the tyrant, then he's going to have a better position himself. Plato's motivation in this is pretty obvious too, and he's very frank about it. If I could get Dionysius II to love philosophy, imagine what that would do for the team A of philosophy. Like, this is his whole project. He wants to increase the honor of philosophy. It's all kind of like, it's not just all this kind of crass brand building exercise, but he sees the potential for like mankind. If powerful men honor philosophy to this extent, and it could really influence this young tyrant for the best. And, when he does this, when Dion invites Plato over, okay, maybe he says something more kind of, in depth than this in the letter that he writes. But Plato basically says, this wasn't about founding some, ideal state where the women and men, don't have that, where they're like the women fight in the wars and like nobody knows who their kid is, like you find in the Republic. It's really about making the man at the top of the pyramid as just as possible. It's pretty simple. It's not like it's a very practical kind of proposal, actually. He's a savvy man. And so he goes and unfortunately they fail. And the courtiers get it into Dionysius II's ear that, Dion is trying to manipulate him through this, guru philosopher guy, and he needs to get away from this philosophy and get away from his controlling uncle and all this stuff. So it kind of falls on its face, unfortunately, and Dion ends up getting exiled to the Peloponnese after this.
But Dion is the one who pays for the land of Plato's school. Is that right?
So there is a story that, for one thing, a spurious story probably, but it's an interesting story that Dionysius the older tyrant, when he sent that he banished Plato from his court, and he sent him back to Athens with this Spartan guy, and he said, "Hey, when you get close to Athens, just sell Plato into slavery." So there's a story that Plato was sold into slavery, and it was Dion who ransomed him. That's one story. There's stories that other people ransomed him. But yeah, there is one story that Dion bought some land for Plato's academy. And it's not clear that he bought all of the land or that he bought any of the land, but that is one account that, it's suggested that he made a gift, like a substantial gift, because Dion has a lot of money as the, marriage relation. So maybe he built an altar on Plato's academy. There's kind of, debate in the sources, but like he's definitely a financial supporter of Plato on some level and has wealth like of a totally different magnitude than Plato has. So like he's an important character. And I believe this is right, that basically it's after Dion gets exiled from Syracuse. So after the second visit of Plato to Syracuse, that Dion really gets closer to Plato's academy, and he ends up in his exile. He ends up spending a lot of time there, getting deeper and making more connections and befriending a lot of Plato's friends. And here's where the kind of business model, if you will, comes in. Because remember, all along, Plato's project is how do we find or create the people capable of ruling in a city of the kind that we envision. And Dion, and he's kind of a talent broker. Dion is there and he's meeting a lot of people that he's going to end up doing some big things with. And when Plato is in Sicily, he brings his entourage as well. He brings Speusippus. So like Dion is not just interested in Plato's political ideas. He's interested in Plato's talent network. This is a big value add that Plato brings to the table for somebody like Dion. This is why somebody in power would want to associate with Plato, because he's done all this work of vetting and filtering the smartest, most ambitious, most well-connected students who are really open to relationships with like-minded people who have spent that time with Plato. It's a very powerful connection, and Dion can see the value of that as a powerful tyrant.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it seems like the more we route out this story of how Plato's intellectual life grew and took hold and succeeded, it seems like really one way to summarize it is that he understood better than anyone else at the time the network nature of influence and power when it comes to ideas. And he understood that it wasn't about making money in terms of cash. It wasn't about even, having, the most widely read book or the book that's talked about by the people in your town and that everyone around you in a popular sense loves and discusses. It was about using true ideas, excellent writing, and truly stellar elite work as a calling card that would gain respect and prestige and attention and admiration from the widest possible network of elite players. By attracting that respect from elites, you would then become the object of interest for young people and aspirants and people who wanted to become great themselves. Because you had these elites paying respect to you, the aspirants would naturally see you as the source of teaching that they wanted to pursue. Because the ideas and the books themselves, the dialogues, were very thoughtfully laced with mystery and certain seductive qualities, basically that would bring a lot of young people into the mix. Plato would train these young people, and then everything becomes even more valuable and attractive to the powerful elite players, because now, lo and behold, Plato's brand has kind of monopolized all of the most promising young people and movers and shakers of the next generation. Is that what else am I missing, or is that a good summary?
I think it's a great summary. And then you can see how this whole idea of the book is not the thing fits into the picture, which you see in the seventh letter. You also see it in the Phaedrus, in this important passage, the story of Thuth and Thamus, or Thoth and Ammon. There's a account he gives. Socrates talks about, well, the god Thoth comes to the king Ammon, and he's got all of these inventions, and he's telling the king Ammon about how great they're going to be for mankind, and he's got the plow, and he's got the whatever fire, but he comes to writing, and he's like, king, they're gonna this is the greatest invention ever. Everybody's going to have an amazing memory because we'll be able to record everything. And King Ammon is like, Thoth, it's one man's job to invent something, it's another man's job to figure out what it's good for. But haven't you realized that you have created a technology to help people forget, not remember, because they're going to write things down and not remember them? And this is a longer discussion about like how people really are actually overvaluing writing. This is coming from the greatest writer of the 4th century, at least. Plato has really mastered this technology, but it's really about this other thing that he's created. For him, it's about changing people. It's about philosophy's ability to form a soul and form connections between people. And this happens over time, and you need that personal contact for him. And the personal contact, now you can see it's the network is the thing. The individuals are the thing. It's not the books. The books are the means, a really, really useful means, but it's not the thing.
So it's all so incredibly and surprisingly relevant to the contemporary intellectual economy, or the marketplace of ideas, if you will, because, well, think about it. There's parallels, so many parallels here, right? Because today, if you want to build a body of work and, make your dent in the world in the realm of ideas, you have all these choices, right? You could write a book if you want and self-publish it. You could write a blog or a newsletter. You could do videos. You could do a podcast. And it's all so open and indeterminate. And this is really giving us an interesting example for sorting through some of these questions ourselves, isn't it? Maybe we could talk a little bit more about this, because I wonder if you have any other takes or implications you want to draw from the lesson of Plato. One thing that comes to my mind is that, in the question I just posed about how should one distribute one's energies in terms of different media and strategies and things of this nature, one clear possible implication of Plato's lesson is that you want really everything to be pointing back to kind of in-person events and community building and stuff like that. And I'm very flattered in a way by this lesson that you've been teaching, because it actually maps really, really well into my intuition, into my own intuitions about how I've built my operation, right? Because, I've always personally just felt intuitively that you want to basically make as much free public content as possible. And that's really not where you want to, charge money. And it's not where you want to create cutoffs at the level of getting just ideas out there. And that's something that's one reason why I don't do like a paid Substack. I don't do a monetized newsletter type thing, because that's never made a lot of sense to me. It's always made more sense to me that you want your ideas to just be out there as far and wide as possible. You don't want those to be constrained by price tags or anything like that. But then if people find value in it and really connect with you on some level, and they kind of take a step into your orbit, then you should come up with ways to, make it economically sustainable. But really you want everything to kind of point towards actually building a crew of awesome people who are really interesting and smart and original. And when you get all those people in the room, then it's like, whoa, the world is our oyster. It's like we could do so many different things with this group of real people that we know and like. And, again, not to toot my own horn, but like the annual meetings that we do are like really, really like this, like when you have like 20 people who are all writers and founders or whatever, artists, just like interesting people on the same kind of vibe, who have high energy, high agency, and high intellect and erudition. it's like, whoa, from there, you can imagine building all kinds of crazy valuable things and perpetuating things into the future in all number of different ways. Um, and so what else could you say about this? What am I right? And what am I missing? Are there other lessons, or what direct lessons have you drawn from Plato in terms of building your own project?
Yeah, I mean, really many of what you just described. It's like get out into the meat space and like realize that what is the thing that you're actually creating. It's this kind of it's I think one of the reasons it's hard to realize that is because it's not, the payoff is hard to quantify, right?
Yeah.
Like it's that relationship. It's this kind of feeling of commonality that takes a long time to craft, and you can craft it now with media and new media, but the payoff for me has always been, okay, what are we going to do in the world, in the physical world, and what can we do with the network once we create it is important. It opens up a lot of possibilities. But yeah, and I think the other lesson is the network is a thing, but that interaction actually circles back around and makes your ideas better too. And this is something that David Perel talks about, right from conversation and these in-person interactions, these intense, maybe focused events. I think it captures a lot of what it was like to be in one of these philosophical schools and why they could command such fiery devotion. And Plato just intuited that, and how it creates better thought. And like the dialogues of the middle period, I think, come out of this ferment of a combination of like relating these ideas to people in public, but also seeing what resonates with the inner circle and this tension.
Right.
It is a feedback loop, a virtuous cycle.
Totally. There's also this interesting commonality between the world you're describing back in Plato's day and our world, which is the really decentralized nature of just the world, right? It's like, you could argue that in maybe the 20th century, we just generally had a more centralized culture in society. Like everything was more centralized, right? You had massive corporations, big bureaucracies, all of the centralization just culturally in many ways, big universities, dominant kind of university brands, right? And nowadays it's just like everything is decentralizing to the point that everything just feels chaotic and unsure. Like no one knows today who really are the best thinkers, or what really are the truest ideas. Like what are truly the best ideas to subscribe to actually live by today? No one knows. It's never been more uncertain. It's never been more unclear. And what you're seeing now is this proliferation of little islands, little sense-making tribes, or little orbits of intelligence and cultural activity becoming patterned. But it's incredibly emergent. It's incredibly decentralized, and there's it's like 1,000 little islands of sense making and creativity, an archipelago, not unlike the Greek city-states, right? Very, very, very much so. And so I think that's one thing that I'm hearing loud and clear in the lessons that you're sharing with us today, is that like the primacy that Plato put on the in-person networks was in large part probably because he sensed that no one knows really what's going on. No one knows what are the true ideas. No one knows, what books they should be reading instead of what other books they should be reading. But what people do know is who they like and who they trust and who they're friends with with. And it's like in a decentralized world of cultural chaos and uncertainty, there is always going to be this kind of profound anchoring premium to the actual people and like and enjoy and learn with and can actually riff with, and who you're going to be writing your blog posts to, and you're going to be writing your letters to, and they're going to be replying to you, right? It's like that's always going to dominate in a way in a decentralized, confusing context. And it seems like he was basically like betting everything on that. Like, I'm just going to build the dominant elite in-person solution to this, confusing, decentralized archipelago. Do you see this, or would you add anything to that, or take anything away from that?
Yeah, I think Plato's career is like a playbook for the intellectual world of the network state. where you don't have these authorities and it's all negotiated kind of in real time. And the way that he got to the success that he did is focus relentlessly on the audience that you're going after, really drill down into who do you want to be with you, what kind of people are out there that you want to attract to your project, aiming as high as possible. And he did a lot of, I think there's more to add. There's another discussion to have about like counter positioning against other figures. He does a lot of that in the dialogues. And you don't necessarily see that going on. He and Isocrates are in this like intense gentlemanly rivalry, and Isocrates will kind of talk about Plato. But maybe he's not actually talking about Plato. It's just those other sophists. But wait, he's talking about Plato, isn't he? Oh, I'm not sure. There's just all this kind of like one-upmanship that he mentions Plato. The one living figure that he mentions in his dialogues is Isocrates in the Phaedrus, and it's clear that he's like going after, I'm trying to define myself against. So, I think you might have to kind of pick your tribe on some level, or, use what other people are doing as a foil intellectually. That's another really important strategy for, intellectual kind of brand building. And there's so many, this is one of the most interesting things about looking at intellectuals from antiquity, is this kind of like brand building happens in practice, in real time, in a decentralized way, through associations and through kind of, self-fashioning, self-presentation. And then this is, academics today find it so distasteful. It's because they don't have to do it, You have that certifying body, and that changes your psychology profoundly.
Well, it's very interesting to think about all this in relationship to the university, because it's easy to see from this lesson you gave today that in a way, from Plato's academy up to the modern university, it's easy to see the analogy. It's easy to see that there's a similar structure or inheritance there, which is that, even to this day, like when people go to universities, the typical person who wants to go to a university really just wants to connect with other people their age who are smart. They want to find a husband or wife who's smart, and they want to form adult friendships that are going to take them to the next stage of life in some ways. And, the university as a modern institution is kind of just like a bureaucratic enactment of all of the intuitions that Plato is seeing in a way, but it becomes sclerotic and overly bureaucratized to the point that, the philosophers are just paid a salary to show up and, say a few words and to publish their articles in all of these kind of like bureaucratized institutional pathways, right? So the logic is kind of all the same, right? It's like the prestige laundering works in the same exact way. The network effect and the network appeal to students, that network power that you get is all the same. And a lot of it is all the same ideas, but the problem is that these modern, overly bureaucratized institutions that are the universities have just become kind of overrun with just too much dead weight, basically. It's like the institutional logic and the kind of heavy, oppressive bureaucratization suffocates all the rest. And so the logic is the same, but it's not able to actually discharge any of its duties or any of these functions that it's supposed to be. It's all just kind of grinded to a halt in a way. And now it makes perfect sense that you're seeing this proliferation of independent academics and people leaving academia and, exiles and autodidacts and you name it, this just exit from this institutional machinery to essentially rebuild in a decentralized way what Plato was figuring out in his day. So it's like, I kind of see, listening to your story, I see the course of Western history kind of being this like big arc where it's like, it starts decentralized, right? Plato figures out the structure of academies, more or less, cracks the code and understands it, right? And then it starts going up, right? And, up until like the 19th or 20th century, where the logic of an academy is kind of brought to its maximum kind of value aggregation ability, right? But then it gets overly stuffy, it gets overly bureaucratized, it kind of stalls out and dies, and then it goes back to this decentralized world. So it's like from Plato up to the university, down, back to Plato, essentially, back to the decentralized marketplace that we're now, people like you and I are kind of figuring out for ourselves now. Is that how you see it?
Yeah. It's like it didn't scale well. I mean, I don't think it even got close to its kind of scale limit in antiquity, or maybe even until mid 20th century. But I think losing touch with, or maybe I say connecting with the original model and what was the essence of it, looking at that historical paradigm can help us to pare down like what is really the essence of this thing that we should look for in new institutions that we create. I mean, institutions are going to get recreated one way or another. Like patterns are going to develop, but maybe we can make better ones that'll not be sclerotic for another century or two, God willing. And, I see so many lessons for kind of institution builders of our day in this story, for sure. Like that's I think the primary interest of it.
Totally. So everybody go subscribe to the Cost of Glory podcast, and you can learn more about Alex at ancientlifecoach.com is where you can find his writing and more information, connect with Alex. And I believe you are doing a retreat soon in Italy, which sounds awesome. Sounds totally awesome. I think you're going to walk around Italy with you and a couple of mates who are highly educated on, all of the cultural and intellectual delights of Italy. And I think you have a whole thing going on with that.
We're focusing on Rome in particular, but
that's right. It's going to be at Rome. Go ahead and give us the quick elevator pitch, and that's at ancientlifecoach.com/retreat. If I had the money and time to go do something like this, and I was interested in some edification on this front, I would 100% give my time and money to do this. I think you'd be in good hands. So it has my full endorsement. But tell people what they can expect. I think you have a few spots open, right?
Yeah, we're kind of doing the Plato playbook, or the ancient philosopher playbook, where so the theme is speak, lead, retreat. We're teaching you about classical rhetoric and hoping that some philosophy comes along to join. But it's a men's retreat, and we've got a few spaces left. We've got a really interesting group of guys that have already signed up. We're going to be in Rome for about a week. I know Rome pretty well, but my colleague lived there for like a decade, and he's just like one of the most knowledgeable people about Rome in the world who speaks English. And so we're going to teach you about ancient rhetoric and see some of the great sites of Roman rhetoric, and have a great time.
Dude, Rome is like one of the best places in the world that I've ever been. It's one of my top favorite places.
Unbelievable.
There's a completely unreal, especially if you're a Christian. Not only if you're a Christian, but if you are, I would almost say, like, I've never been on one of your retreats, and I don't know too much about it, but I know you pretty well now, Alex. I would say that if you're a man and you're a Christian and you have the time and money to even possibly pull this off, I think you should do it. If not now, do it at some point. You have to go to Rome. It's like, if you're a Christian, it's unreal. It's like, you will never feel the same about Christianity after going. It's just like, you have to get to Rome. You really have to. And this sounds like as good a pretext for doing that as any. So that's really cool.
And Eric's a traditional Catholic, and he knows the Christian parts of Rome just as well. And it's so mind blowing,
insane, dude. It's the most insane place. It's like every single block has like a church. That's the most beautiful church you've ever seen, like over and over and over again. It's like, it's nuts. Honestly, it's like the scale of the beauty and the amount of just the sheer amount and of the beauty and the quality of the beauty. Like St. Peter's, one of the craziest places you could ever step into. Like, I think St. Peter's Basilica is probably the single craziest place I've ever stepped foot in. It's just like, it's so much more than you can imagine from pictures. It's like absurd. Anyway, that's my little love letter to Rome. Amazing place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dude, this is awesome. Anything we're leaving out? It sounds like basically, if you want to build a lasting influence in the world, you need to build an academy, and you do that by writing top-notch work, really paying close attention to quality and craftsmanship, writing to the most elite audience you possibly are capable of, letting those ideas get out there, not trying to charge money for anything unless you have to, and from the network that emerges, just cultivate that network. Grow that network, allow for mystery, create layers for people to enter into where the books are just the calling card, but the in-person network is kind of the real value that everyone builds together and that people will get the most out of. And that sounds like pretty much Plato's playbook. Or anything else you would really emphasize?
Yeah, time would fail us. There's a lot of examples of people doing this in antiquity and in the Renaissance, and I think it's a fascinating and an extremely fruitful model. So, yeah, let's do it.
Dude, it's really almost bizarre how much it maps onto the contemporary situation. So I think there's a lot here for people who are trying to find their own way in this new independent, decentralized marketplace of ideas. I never would have thought really until I met you that the ancient world has so much to teach on precisely this challenge that people like you and I are trying to figure out. So I think this will be very useful for a lot of people kind of in our orbit.
Yeah, and your community has been a real inspiration in me, like wanting to get this idea out more urgently, for sure. So keep doing it. I'm along for the ride.
Totally. Thank you so much for those kind words, and thank you for coming on today. I appreciate it. And like I said, yeah, check out Alex's retreat. Check out the Cost of Glory podcast. You can get that wherever you get your podcasts. And it's real nice, by the way. It's a very, very fine production value. Alex puts a ton of work into these highly well-researched, podcasts. Basically, like the Dan Carlin podcast, if you've ever listened to one of those, like detailed historical research podcasts with like a real attention to detail. And I think Alex is building pretty much I think you're building this kind of like eternal evergreen store of audio knowledge in a way, not unlike what Plutarch did with his lives, but you're doing it basically in podcast format. So people should definitely check that out. Thank you so much, man. Appreciate it. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Justin.